There's finally snow on the ground in Chicago. It is a sunny 23-degree day, and I have my tea here. I think it's finally time to talk about some winter books. So several months ago, I asked you all to help me pick 4 books to pre-order for the fall. I think I asked you all in August and gave a list of books that were coming out from independent and nonprofit presses in fall 2024, and then had you all vote on a list of books that I talked about in a video. And then the books that got the most votes, I pre-ordered, and then I read them this fall and was preparing to tell you all about them. As I was thinking about putting together that video, I also wanted to put together a video about books for reading in the winter, the kind of books that I like to read in the winter time. And as I was thinking through the books that I'd read recently that would be perfect winter reads for me, I realized that the books I kept thinking about were the books I had just read from my fall pre-orders video. They all kind of just fit nicely into the kind of categories I tend to think about for reading in winter. And so I decided to combine those two into one video today. The tea I'm drinking today is a bergamot rose tea. It's delicious. It's got some lavender in it too, lavender and rose. Delicious. It's a little bit tart. Yum. Okay, where should we start? So 3 of these books will look very familiar to you because you've seen them if you've watched my top books of 2024 video, but I want to talk a little bit more about them for you today. First up, we have Herscht 07769. This is by Laszlo Krasznahorkai, and it's translated by Audelie Moslet, and this is published by New Directions. There are several reasons I love this particular book for the winter time. It is a very bleak subject matter, which I think fits if you live where I live, Chicago. It gets pretty bleak in the winter, although I love a day like this when it's sunny and cold and there's snow. I love a good sunny 20-degree day in Chicago. I like to walk around in that kind of weather. But this is not just bleak, but it starts, how does it start? It starts here by saying hope is a mistake. You can't get much more bleak than that. But this also has a lot of heart. So I read that hope is a mistake and I said, oh, I'm in for a ride here. But I don't know. I feel like there's still a fair amount of hope in this book. I always love a good, thick, challenging book in the wintertime. I feel like it's the perfect time to dive into something that is a little bit tougher of a read. And this book in particular is maybe not everybody's cup of tea because it is one single sentence. This whole 400-some page book is a single sentence. So yeah, that takes some adjustment. I would say it's a challenge, but it's not too much of a challenge. It's also set in a small town in eastern Germany, and a good chunk of it takes place during the winter time. I feel like, for some reason, Germany makes me think winter. I don't know if it's because I'm partially German and all the German kind of traditions that I know of are related to Christmas and the holidays or what it is, but I think Germany and I think winter. So for me, this is a great wintertime book. This novel starts out following Florian Herscht, who is a gentle giant of a character. He's a young man, probably in his early 20s, and he has just left some kind of institution where he was, I don't know if it was a school or a health-related institution, but he's just left in the care of a man known as the boss. And we don't really know the relationship between Florian and the boss, but the boss is his caretaker, more or less, and the boss employs Florian to help him in his business of cleaning up graffiti on buildings and parks. And yeah, that's their job. They go around cleaning up graffiti. The boss is also the member and kind of the leader of a local neo-Nazi group. And he makes Florian do a lot of activities related to that group, which Florian is not really wanting to do, but he does it because he's grateful to the boss for looking after him. Florian also is beloved by this entire town. Everyone in town really cares about Florian and wants the best for him, and they give him odd jobs here and there. They give him food. They try to talk him out of hanging around the boss because they're concerned about him. They don't want him hanging around this neo-Nazi group. He also befriends a professor of physics who is also kind of the local weatherman. Florian is really interested in self-improvement. He's kind of a young, innocent type character, has a lot of childlike qualities to him, and he takes this class, an adult education class on physics. One of the things this physics professor teaches his class is that some theory that is related to the creation of the universe and ultimately suggests that the universe could be extinguished at any moment. It could just blink of an eye, the universe could be destroyed, gone, nothing, as if it never existed. And so the professor mentioned this in his class, and Florian gets this idea in his head and cannot let go of the fear that at any moment he and everything he knows could cease to exist. And so he takes it upon himself to try to do something about it. And so what he does is he starts a letter writing campaign on his own to Angela Merkel, because in his mind, the only person who could possibly prevent this from happening or help it from happening is Angela Merkel. And so he writes her endless letters trying to tell her what might happen, and she needs to do something about it. And he even goes to try and see her, and it just becomes this whole thing where he's trying to alert her that this could happen. And everyone in town knows he's writing these letters, and they kind of laugh at him, and they kind of try to get him to stop and realize that it's not going to do anything. Meanwhile, this boss is obsessed with Johann Sebastian Bach, and somebody starts graffitiing Bach monuments in the local area, and the boss starts freaking out. And then there are these wolves that come and start attacking people. So there's a whole heck of a lot going on in here. All of these details kind of converge and lead to kind of a major crisis for the town and for Florian. And we see a real change in Florian and a loss of innocence by the end. And I think that's where the hope is a mistake piece comes in. What's interesting about this book, and what I've seen other reviewers say, is the one sentence structure for some folks hasn't worked for them. And for a big reason being that it's one sentence, but it still goes into the minds of many different characters. It's not just one sentence in the consciousness of one character, like some other books, maybe Ducks Newburyport might be one that is one sentence or several very, very long sentences that are all just in the consciousness of one character. Mark Nash mentioned this in his review of this book. So the idea is if you have a single sentence within a novel, it really should be that single sentence works best if it's in a kind of a stream of consciousness style within the mind of one character. And it doesn't work nearly as well if you have one sentence, but it's going through the minds of many different characters. For me, I thought it did work fabulously. I thought it worked because I thought it spoke to the way ideas and experiences and rumors and group dynamics kind of spread through a small community, or really any community. And so that's why I thought it worked well, that it was kind of tracing the evolution of various incidents within this small town, and kind of was showing how kind of groupthink about certain situations can happen. And yeah, I think it just showed a consciousness of this entire town really through this one sentence, was how I read it. I also could really imagine Krasznahorkai sitting down and writing this one single sentence, not in one go, but I could just feel the momentum of him. I sat and I read this, and I felt like I could feel him needing to write it in this rush of thought. And it was really evocative of the writing process for me somehow, of how just this all came rushing out. So that was really cool for me to kind of experience through this book. I really loved the language. I loved that intense forward drive of this one single rushing sentence. I think I've decided I really love books with like one sentence or is like made up of very, very, very long sentences, like Jan Fosse's Septology and like the really long sentences in hurricane season. I think that's my kind of jam. I really love that style because I think it creates a rhythm that is just so fun to keep reading and following along with. Plot got a little bit wacky and there were some formatting choices that I thought were interesting. Like there are these inserted phrases that didn't make any sense to what was happening in the narrative, but then when you read them all together, they kind of form like kind of a sentence. Overall, just the community, the townspeople were so charming and wonderful that won me over at the end of the day for this bleak, strange one-sentence novel. Next up, another book that made my top books of the year, that would be Pages of the Sea by Anne Hawke. This is published by Biblioasis, and the reason this is a winter book for me is because it takes place on a Caribbean island, and I always feel the need to read something that takes place in a warm weather location in the winter. I don't know about you. Does anybody else feel that way? That is a must have for me for the wintertime. And this not only takes place on a Caribbean island, but it also takes place between right before Christmas up until Easter. So it's in the winter, even though it's very warm and hot there. It's also a beautifully quiet story of a little girl named Wheeler who lives on this unnamed island with her family in, I think, it's either the late 60s or the early 70s. And her mother has moved to England to find work and has left Wheeler and her two sisters behind with family members, and specifically with a few of her aunts and her cousins, and so they're all living together in this house. And Wheeler is not having a great time of it. She doesn't fully understand why her mother has left. She doesn't at all grasp how long her mother is going to be gone and how long it's going to take before her mother can bring them to England. She doesn't realize it's going to be years. And that's because Wheeler's the youngest in this family, and nobody is communicating anything to Wheeler properly. No one is telling her what's going on. And so she's just living kind of with a lot of unknowns and is really struggling and is not being treated well by her family at all. I mentioned this in my video about my favorite books of 2024. This book I picked up right after Herscht 07769, and I thought, I had just read this like one sentence novel that I thought was like a challenge, but it wasn't really a challenge to read. And I picked this up and barely could get into it. And part of that is because parts of the narration are in Wheeler's like dialect, and that is interspersed that like in her dialogue, but also in the narration itself. And it took me a really long time to get used to the rhythm of that, and to get used to the rhythm of her speech, and to get used to the switching between different types of language, different types of English. And so that just really, really threw me for a loop for a minute as I was reading this book. But once I got the hang of it, I was invested in little sweet Wheeler and her story. The island and the community is stunningly depicted. The ending is so wonderful and like uplifting, and in a really tough family situation. I described this book, even myself, like as I was starting to talk about this book, as quiet. And I'm realizing now that it's such a strange word to attach to this, because it's not quiet. Wheeler is not a quiet child. It's full of life and rage and unfairness, and it's not quiet at all. But for some reason, I think we like to attach the word quiet to anything that's like about a family, especially if it's about a female child. I feel like that's a word that just kind of just tumbled out of my mouth, even though when I think about it, it's not really quiet. The major conflict in here comes from something Wheeler is asked to do by one of her aunts at the beginning of the novel, and then she does it, but she gets in really, really big trouble for it. And you don't know why. Like, there's no explanation of why this kind of simple thing was something she got in trouble for, and you don't understand it till pretty much the very end. And so that's a little confusing, trying to follow along without knowing the full story of the family's secrets. It's not first person, but you're in Wheeler's perspective, and you're living within that confusion, I think, that she is feeling and experiencing by being left behind by her mother and by the rest of her family not really telling her anything that is going on within the family. And so you exist within that confusion for a lot of this novel, and I thought that was really well done. So I think this is an absolutely perfect book to read in the wintertime. It's not that long. I think a lot of people would really love this book. We have yet another book that made my top books of the year list, and that's Caesarea by Hannah Nordenhoek. It's translated by Saskia Vogel, and this is published by Book Hug Press. This is the story of another young girl. This one is definitely not quiet. This is a young girl who was orphaned when her mother died in childbirth. She was delivered via C-section, and the surgeon who performed the C-section took Caesarea, named her Caesarea to name her after the procedure that saved her life, and he raised her. He took her to a remote estate that he owned in the forests of Sweden, and he raised her. And she was an orphan. Her mother was, I think, maybe a maid, and so she was not destined for a particularly good life. And so you would think that the surgeon taking Caesarea and raising her, it was a noble thing for him to do. And indeed, he believes it was a very noble thing for him to do as well. But it's a little more complicated than that. He keeps her completely isolated in the middle of this forest. He does not raise her with his own children. He does not allow her off this estate. He doesn't allow her to be with other children her own age, or really anyone else but the very few employees of this farm. So there's a woman who is like a nurse and a maid and who lives and takes care of Caesarea. And then there's a man who works the farm, and then there's a rotating series of maids who come in to take care of both the farm and the house. And so Caesarea lives this very isolated existence and really just looks forward to the few times that the surgeon comes to visit her. He teaches her, so she's very intelligent. He educates her, but he also does really weird things. Like, he kept Caesarea's mother's pelvic bone and keeps it in his office there, and he'll like show it to her and like talk about the C-section that saved her life in like graphic detail, and tells her the story of her birth and how he saved her and makes her like hold her mother's bones, and it's just really horrifying stuff. In and out come a few characters like the piano tuner and a couple other people who are really have poor intentions, and crisis builds from there as Caesarea starts to become a young woman and starts to realize some of the things that are going on, and that all builds up to a big moment of crisis at the end. This book jumps back and forth in time a lot, so you kind of have a hint of kind of some of the things that are going to happen later in her like teenage years, but then you jump back to when she's a young girl. This is perfect for winter because, for me at least, because it jumps back and forth in time, it doesn't take place only in winter. There are lots of beautiful, beautiful scenes in the summertime in this gorgeous forest, but then there's a lot of stuff that happens in the cold depths of winter in this story, and so I don't know, just somehow being in this isolated, almost fairy tale, very, very dark fairy tale-like place makes me think of wintertime. This, for me, is a beautiful short novel for the wintertime. Then we have Bad Houses by John Elizabeth Stintsey. This is published by Arsenal Pulp Press. This could have been on my top books of the year list because the stories in here are amazing for me. They're weird, surreal, quirky. Some of them are very fairy tale like. I loved Stintsey's earlier book, My Volcano. That was published in Canada by Arsenal Pulp Press and then in the US by $2 Radio. And so I knew I would love these stories because I loved My Volcano so much. So again, this is a mix of the surreal and the fairy tale, but in contemporary settings. There are monsters made of moldy cheese. There are characters whose body parts fall off. There is a dead elephant that is decaying in the living room of a couple that is on the verge of a breakup. That was a good story. But the reason it's on this winter list is that it incorporates all of the other categories I've already mentioned. There are forests in here, one forest in particular that's inhabited by trolls. There is deep cold in here. There's a story where it won't stop snowing and the snow accumulates all the way up to the top of an apartment building. There is a story set on an island that is near another island that you can only access by a rope that goes from one island to the other, and what happens if the rope breaks and you're suddenly stranded. So it's got that island aspect as well. There's a lot of darkness in these stories, a lot of dark deeds and dark thoughts and dark consequences, which of course makes me think of the wintertime as well. But what I think makes me think most of the wintertime when I'm reading this book is the feeling of being told a tale. You know, that feeling of like being around a fireplace and someone telling some kind of spooky, weird story. A lot of these stories evoke fairy tales and myths like Midas and folk tales like Baba Yaga, that feeling of being told a tale that has consequences at the end. So I highly recommend this collection if you love weird and surreal and fairy tale-like stories. This is a great one to pick up. And finally, if you've been counting, you will see that was only 4 books, and I said there would be 5. The last book is not a book I've read yet, but it falls into one major category that I always look for in the winter, and that is a big, fat historical novel. Better yet, make it kind of experimental. Better yet, make it translated, and you got a great winter read to really sink into. This is also a preview of what is to come on my channel. This was nominated for the upcoming Republic of Consciousness Prize for the US and Canada. This is The Case of Sem. It's by Vera Mutavcheva and it's translated by Angela Rodell. This is a Bulgarian novel that was republished. It was originally written in the 60s, I think. Yes, so it was originally published in 1967 at the height of the Cold War by the prominent Ottomanist Vera Mutavcheva, and that's from the translator's note at the beginning. This was republished in English just this past year, and I'm just going to read from the back here so you can get an idea of what this is about. It's 1481. I'm sold already. And as seen from the centers of power in Rome and Venice, the cultures of Europe are under threat from the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. When the exalted Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror dies, his eldest son, Bayezid, takes the throne. However, discontented factions within the Ottoman army urge Mehmed's second son, Sem, a well-educated and experienced warrior, to oppose his brother's ascension, igniting a ruthless power struggle and forcing Sem into long years of exile. This is a polyphonic novel, so I think it's told through the testimony of many different characters. The translator's note says the book's structure is anything but straightforward. The story is presented as a series of depositions by historical figures before a court, bringing medieval history and modern courtroom drama together in a way that is extremely experimental for Bulgarian literature of the time. Experimental, historical, chunky, translated. I mean, what more could you ask for? I'm excited to dive into this winter. What are your go-to wintertime styles of book? Do you have any big plans for reading this winter if you live somewhere that's going to be plunged into the depths of frigid temperatures like I do? fairly soon. You know, it's charming now to be cozy inside on a 20-degree day, but that's gonna get old pretty soon. I would love to know your winter reading plans. Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Sarah, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.